The House is gearing up for a final vote on President Biden's $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief plan. They're doing that this week. The updated American Rescue Plan includes $1,400 stimulus checks for those who qualify, jobless benefits, and sets aside money to reopen schools and distribute more coronavirus vaccines. It is one of Congress's largest ever economic relief bills, and top Democrats say they are confident in their ability to pass it, even if Republicans do not vote in favor of it. Let's bring in Ed O'Keefe at the White House. So yesterday, Ed, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, in a briefing, said that the White House is taking nothing for granted regarding passage of the relief plan. Why is that, and how soon could the bill make it to the president?
Well, the how soon remains an open question, Vlad and Anne-Marie. Good to see you both. Partly because there's a bit of a paperwork holdup. You don't just move a $1.9 trillion piece of legislation between the Senate and the House willy-nilly. They've got to make sure that it's completely put together, and there's been a delay. There was a thought that the House would pass it today. It may slip to tomorrow because the Senate hasn't officially transmitted it over to the House. So we'll see about that. As for the, taking nothing for granted, there's no reason to believe there are going to be mass defections of Democrats from this final vote. But obviously, leadership wants to make sure that everybody's on board. Part of the reason is because the majority, of course, is so small. Just a handful of votes separate Democrats from Republicans. And in the coming days, it's actually going to get even smaller because at least two members of the House, Marcia Fudge of Ohio and Deb Haaland of New Mexico, are headed to the Biden cabinet to run the Departments of Housing and Urban Development and Interior, respectively. So while they're expected to be in place for this big vote, after this big vote, the margin's going to shrink even more until special elections are held later this year. There were two Democrats who voted against the original version of the bill that was passed by the House a few days back. There's hope here at the White House that maybe one or two Republicans would, for whatever reason, suddenly vote for it, but no signs that there are any signing on.
So former Congressman and senior advisor to President Biden, Cedric Richmond, joined Red and Blue yesterday to discuss the American Rescue Plan. Here's what he told our colleague Elaine Keano about the $15 minimum wage increase that did not make it into the relief package.
President Biden has the will to get the minimum wage up to $15 because he believes that not one person in this country should work 40 hours a week and still live in poverty. And that's a value statement. And we're not going to compromise our values. We're going to keep working, and we're going to figure out how to get it done.
Okay, that's nice, but are there any plans to make this happen? Because Plan A didn't work out.
Fair point. No, there is no official Plan B just yet, other than a general belief that it has to be done. And an agreement really in Washington, across Washington, that the minimum wage has to be increased. The question would be by how much and when. And so there are various proposals out there. There's one, for example, from Republicans Mitt Romney and Tom Cotton that would combine a minimum wage increase over the next several years to at least $11 an hour with changes to the E-Verify immigration employment verification program. That's an interesting proposal that is out there. Democrats, of course, like Bernie Sanders, pushing to get it to $15 an hour across the country, national standard, as quickly as possible. Other Democrats, like Joe Manchin, say, now, hold on a second, would like to raise the minimum wage, but getting it to $15 an hour is a bit too rich for companies in my state. Maybe we've got to index it for inflation and geography across the country. It hits a certain mark in New York City, say, and a different one in Kansas City. We'll see over the course of the next few days and weeks, I think, where this debate will go. But for one reason, a very crass one, there is going to likely be a debate about this at some point, and that is the Democrats would love to put Republicans on the record about this again and finally get them to hold a vote on this in a way that benefits Democrats politically. And so whether that happens this spring, whether they wait till the fall as part of a bigger package, we'll see. But again, there's general agreement it should be done, as there is with most things in this town. There's usually general agreement that something has to be done to address an issue. It just gets bogged down by the details. And, this is part of the big question that's facing this White House. You're going to sign this big bill this week. Domestic achievement number one is done. The big to-do is off the list. But where do you go next? Do you go to a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure plan? Do you find a way to combat climate change? Do you fight for changes to voting rights laws across the country, and in doing so potentially have to change the rules of the Senate? Do you, take on the minimum wage as a standalone issue? All of these things up for consideration by this White House and congressional Democrats as they realize that the further you get into the year, the less time they'll have to get big things done.
So the president's coronavirus relief bill is expected to help expand the Affordable Care Act and also make health insurance affordable for more than 1 million middle-class Americans. And it's tackling a major enhancement to the social safety net in the country. We're also hearing that the infrastructure could be next on the agenda for the administration, another very expensive piece of legislation. So what does this tell us about the White House's attitude towards big government? And we talked about this yesterday. I'm curious how they feel about support for this, not from Republicans, but from just Americans.
Yeah, look, across the country, majority of Americans believe there's got to be an expansion of government-offered health insurance, not necessarily everyone being on a government-run plan, but the option has to be there. There is broad bipartisan support across the country for the bill that will be signed this week, is expected to be signed this week. And there's a general belief and understanding that there's got to be more investment in things like fixing roads and bridges, water systems across the country, airports, and other bits of infrastructure. And there's a great eagerness here in Washington to find a way to do that in both parties. The question will be, how expensive should it be, and how's it going to be paid for? The infrastructure proposals could run as much as $3 trillion, $4 trillion, which makes this current legislation look like pennies. And so you're going to have a fight there about, do you raise taxes? Well, which ones and on who? And those are where the details of this and the real debate will get bogged down. But to the point about Obamacare, this is the most significant expansion of the law, certainly in recent years, because it's going to, for 2 years now, put about $34 billion into the exchanges, or those, those programs that people can sign up for in the states, should they get knocked off their health care, should they just need it in general and they're eligible. But it's a temporary extension. And it's seen for now as sort of a Band-Aid on a promise that the president has made to expand and sort of fortify the Affordable Care Act as it exists right now, to keep those exchanges viable and make them more permanent, and not face the potential for getting chipped away at should power here in Washington shift again. So this doesn't fulfill his pledge to fortify the existing healthcare system, but it's certainly a notable expansion. And it's one of those things that Republicans are saying, this doesn't have anything to do specifically with relief from the pandemic. Democrats would turn around and say, yes, it does, because a bunch of people got laid off, they lost their health insurance, they need it. This is one way to help make sure that they have protection.
So there's a new problem, or maybe a growing problem, that is occurring at the border with Mexico the Biden administration has to tackle. More than 3,200 migrant children were stuck in Border Patrol facilities on Monday, with nearly half held beyond the 3-day limit. So what are you hearing about the White House's plan to care for these children? And is the administration, concerned that these challenges might threaten President Biden's efforts to legalize millions of undocumented immigrants?
I think the short answer to that, Anne-Marie, is yes. They understand that this is a brewing crisis, one that really has never gone away, but that has become much more urgent and apparent in the last month, with record numbers of undocumented migrants getting to the border, crossing over, especially unaccompanied children. What we don't know is why specifically these children are coming, but it's pretty well advertised that there's been a change in power here at the White House over the last 2 months, and a promise from the new guy to change the nation's immigration laws. So that may be compelling people in Central America and Mexico to head for the border, thinking, perhaps wrongly, that they're going to get an easier time of it now that there's a new president. This was so urgent that the president sent a group of aides to the border over the weekend, led by Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, to get a better handle on what's going on, come back to him with some proposals on what exactly to do. Part of what's causing thousands of these kids in general, hundreds, specifically thousands overall over the course of the last few weeks, to get held up in some of these facilities where they're not supposed to be, is the pandemic. Eventually, they're supposed to end up in facilities run by the Department of Health and Human Services, and they're only supposed to be there for a little while before they get processed through and handed over either to foster parents or to extended family that they may have here in the United States. But in many cases, they're stopping first and being held in facilities that are meant for adult undocumented migrants, that are run by Customs and Border Protection, for example. And the issue again is they got to space them out. They got to create social distance. They got to test these kids. They got to make sure that they don't, get exposed or have COVID-19. That, plus the increased, influx, is causing a real strain, and it's causing a bit of "I told you so," frankly, from the president's critics, who warned that, you know, the differences that they were going to enact in immigration policy had the potential to start drawing more people to cross the border illegally, or at least to try to. And the administration, quite notably, said last week, through Secretary Mayorkas, in essence, don't come yet, because we haven't sorted out how exactly to do this. That was seized on by Republicans. Say, why are you telling them to come at all this way when this isn't the legal way to do it? That's a fair point, but I think it's also an acknowledgement by this administration that they're going to keep coming no matter what, and there's very little that they can do to stop them until they get to the border and they can be processed.
So sticking on immigration, Ed, the administration now has announced that it will offer deportation relief and work permits to hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan immigrants living in the United States. It will also renew U.S. sanctions intended to isolate the country. Both measures mark a shift from U.S. policy towards Venezuela under President Trump. What are you hearing about it?
Right. So about 320,000 Venezuelans currently here in the United States could be eligible for temporary protected status. This is a status that is afforded to people from places like El Salvador, Haiti, Syria, essentially, you know, troubled nations from which people are fleeing for whatever reason. President campaigned on the promise of keeping TPS in place, expanding it to Venezuela. They're going to review sanctions and other steps that have been taken against the Maduro government. They made the point yesterday that they recognize that Juan Guaido and the interim government that he tried to establish is the legitimate one and the one that they intend to work with and to support in its ongoing talks with what they called an illegal regime run by Maduro because of what he did back in 2018. But by extending it to 320,000 people, they have 180 days to apply for TPS status. It costs about $545 to process that application because you got to go through a bunch of background checks and whatnot. Designed to reinforce that this is an administration that believes in extending those protections and that they're needed. And it's part of the ongoing shift in immigration policy across the government that is far different than how the Trump administration ran things.
All right. Ed O'Keefe for us at the White House, my friend. Thank you very much.
Take care.